I'm going to turn in your Bible to Isaiah chapter 17. And that's where our studies will be centered on this morning. I plan to do two things. This is about the burden of Damascus. I want to talk about the history of Damascus, the prophecies that Isaiah made about the city of Damascus in Isaiah 17, and then a New Testament story about Damascus. And so that's where we'll be going today. And then we hear about Damascus in the news. And it's not good news. Damascus is in Syria. And if you keep up with the news at all, and I don't know all the details, but it's just a tragedy what's going on in Syria, all the conflict and the factions, and we just sit and wonder how that could be in this world. And Damascus is the capital city of that nation of Syria today, and it was the capital city of ancient Syria. Damascus is one of the oldest cities in the world. And it has been said, and I find this often in looking up different things about Damascus, that of all the cities in the world, the people have lived continuously in Damascus longer than any other city in the world. That doesn't mean it's the oldest city, but it's had that continuous occupation more than any other city in the world. Okay, everybody says that. But I doubt that, because I read in the book of Isaiah chapter 17 in verse 1, when Isaiah is talking about the Assyrians coming up, and it's going to come in like a flood upon Damascus, and it will be no more city and no more inhabited. It sounds like there was at least a period of time where Damascus was deserted, according to Isaiah. And I take what Isaiah says above all the legends that you hear about people. But maybe that didn't last long. Maybe everyone scattered from Damascus. And after a few years, people came back into it. But that's the city of Damascus. We read about Damascus. We don't know this, but when Abraham was called to go into the promised land from the Ur of Chaldees, he took his father Terah with him. And then he got to Haran. And it doesn't exactly say this. When you start figuring out all the different times and what must have happened, it sounds like Abraham stayed in Haran for 5 years. And that's probably, it doesn't say this, but maybe the reason he stayed, because old Terah, he just couldn't keep going. I mean, he was an old man. Abraham buried his father in Haran. And after Terah died, Abraham continued on into the promised land. And the road that would have gone from Haran to Shechem, where Abraham built an altar to the Lord when he entered that land, would have passed through Damascus. So it doesn't mention Abraham in Damascus at that time. But it's very likely Abraham would have gone through that city on his way to that new land where the Lord said he would give it to his seed someday as an inheritance. Now, we do read this. The kings of the east raided that land of Israel. It wasn't Israel called at that time, the land of Canaan. The kings of the east raided that, and they took Lot as a hostage. And when one of the servants of Lot escaped and ran and told Uncle Abraham, said, they've got your nephew, Lot. And he's a brother in that he's kin to him. So they had captured him. Abraham gathered his servants, and he had over 300. And with that little small band he took after 5 kings of the east. And he caught up with them. And he divided his forces. And by night he attacked. And it sent them into a panic. And they fled, and he pursued them. It says all the way unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. Now, looking back at the map here, you know, if you look up left, you'd think, well, that'd be toward the west, wouldn't it, on the left hand? Probably not, because they were probably looking toward the east. And there is a place that they're not sure where Hobah was, but they think it's a city north of Damascus. That would be on the left hand if you're looking toward the east. And so that sounds like Abraham may have gone through Damascus at that time as well. In the next chapter, we read about a trusted servant of Abraham, Eleazar of Damascus. But then we don't read a lot about Damascus in the book of Genesis or in the book of Exodus or through the Old Law. But we come across them again when we come into the story of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. David's great kingdom. If you look there, you can see Damascus and Samaria in Israel. Now that is also called Ephraim, okay, because of the dominance of the tribe of Ephraim in northern Israel. And then Jerusalem in Judah, and I've got an arrow pointed there, and that points to a little city that's not on this map in the land of Moab, named Aroer. And we'll read about that in just a minute, but that's where we're going to talk about here for now. As David expanded his kingdom, he put soldiers in Damascus, and they became David's servants. And after David died, there were two kings that came into the land of Syria and Damascus, and they gave Solomon problems. See, Solomon didn't follow God as faithful as David. And to chastise him, God put these kings, and they rebelled against Solomon and gave Solomon problems all the days of his reign. After Solomon died, the kingdom divided, and so you've got Israel to the north and Judah to the south, and the capital of Israel to the north is that Samaria, and the capital of Judah to the south is Jerusalem. And Asa became king in Jerusalem, and the kings in Israel came to do war against Jerusalem and to capture Jerusalem. And so Asa sent silver and gold to the king of Damascus to bribe him into raiding the land of Israel to take the pressure off Jerusalem. And that's what those kings did. And then there was for many, many years conflict between Israel and Ephraim and Samaria, and that land on that map marked as Israel, and Damascus and Syria to the north. A lot of conflict between them. And during the reign of, or during the time of Elisha the prophet, there's a lot going on between Israel and Damascus up there. Okay, one of the things, they had a truce. And during that truce, there's the interesting story of a man named Naaman. He was like the general of the army of the Syrians. He wasn't the king. He was a great man and an honorable man and a mighty man, but he had leprosy. And a little servant girl that he had taken during one of the raids into Israel told Naaman's wife that, oh, if you knew the prophet in Israel, he could heal you of your leprosy. And that was Elisha. So Naaman, the mighty Naaman, came looking for Elisha the prophet in Israel. And Naaman had the idea, boy, I'm a big important man, and there's really something wonderful going to happen here. Elisha will come out, and there'll be some great pronouncement or some great deed. And it didn't happen that way. Elisha didn't even see him. Elisha just sent his servant out there. Go tell Naaman he wants to be healed of leprosy. Go dip 7 times in the Jordan River. Well, that made Naaman mad. He thought, well, I'm too big and too important to be treated like that. And now instead of being a leper, he was an angry leper. That anger wasn't doing him any good. And the servant came to Naaman and said, Naaman, and reasoned with him, says, Naaman, if the prophet had bid thee to do some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? Why don't you just wash and be clean? And so Naaman did. Naaman went down in the river and dipped himself 7 times in the river Jordan. And he came up, according to the saying of the man of God, he came up, his flesh came again unto him like the flesh of a little child. And he was clean. You know, sometimes we think we need to tell God how he needs to do things. God does things in lowly ways, doesn't He? And He humbles us. And when that Naaman humbled himself and did what God said, he was cleansed. I want you to remember that. There's many other stories I won't get into now about the conflict between Syria and Israel. And it's a very interesting set of events that took place during the days of those prophets. But there is another kingdom that arose in that ancient time, and that is Assyria. Now, Assyria is toward the north. And the Assyrians were growing in strength and power. And the king in Damascus, who was king over Syria, felt threatened by the rise of the people at Nineveh and Assyria. So he got a plan. We kings, we've been fighting with each other down through here. We need to get together and have a confederacy. And by joining ourselves together we'll be able to resist the advance of Assyria to the north. Well, the king in Ephraim, in Israel, the king of Samaria, so I'll go along with that. And evidently we're going to see here, and when Isaiah said the king of Aroer in Moab and the little cities around there, so we'll go along with that. But Ahaz was king in Jerusalem. He said, we're not going to do it. We're not going to join in that confederacy with you. So, the king in Damascus and the king in Ephraim, we'll know what to do about that. We'll go against Jerusalem, and we'll take Ahaz and get him off the throne, and we'll put a king of our own choosing on the throne that'll do what we want him to do. And so they came together to advance against Jerusalem. Now that's when Isaiah the prophet comes on the scene. And Isaiah goes to the king of Ahaz and says, you don't have to worry about these two kings, these two smoking firebrands, he called them. And he said, ask a sign. And Ahaz says, I'm not going to ask for a sign. See, Ahaz didn't care about Jehovah, and he didn't care about Isaiah. But Isaiah said, well, the Lord himself will give you a sign. And the house of David will not fall. And that's when Isaiah said, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and thou shalt call his name Emmanuel. And that prophecy was an assurance that the house of David would stand. Of course, we know how that's fulfilled in Matthew chapter 1 with the coming of Christ. Now that sets the scene for the prophecy in Isaiah chapter 17. Because Isaiah is going to talk about the burden of Damascus. Now remember, when a prophet had a burden, that means this is bad news. But it's not just Damascus. It's about all those involved in that confederacy that Damascus was trying to form to resist those Assyrians. Oh, so this is against Damascus and against Aroer, which is that city in Moab, and against Ephraim, which was the kind of the nickname for that nation of northern Israel, whose capital is at Samaria, called here the fortress. That would be at Samaria in Ephraim. And so this burden consists really of that entire confederacy, but it centers on Damascus, because they were the ones taking the lead. Now let's go through Isaiah chapter, that's part 1. Part 2, we're going to go through this prophecy and see what it was Isaiah said. And understanding it in context, I think you'll appreciate the power of his words. Here we go. The burden of Damascus. Behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city. It shall be a ruinous heap. The cities of Aroer are forsaken. They shall be for flocks, which shall lie down, and none shall make them afraid. Sounds like you're going to just turn that little town into a pasture, doesn't it? And then he says, the fortress also shall cease from Ephraim. That would be Samaria. And the kingdom from Damascus and the remnant of Syria. They shall be as the glory of the children of Israel, saith the Lord of hosts. That almost sounds nice. Well, they'll be as glorious as Israel. But look what he says about Israel's glory. And in that day it'll come to pass that the glory of Jacob shall be made thin, and the fatness of his flesh shall wax wan. And it shall be as when the harvestman gathereth the corn and reapeth the ears with his arms, and it shall be as he that gathereth ears in the valley of Rephaim. Well, you've seen the harvest, the crops when they're ready for harvest, how beautiful it is, be it wheat or corn or beans. And then what happens? Well, then comes the harvest. After those combines get through, you look out over that field and what do you see? Everything's been all torn up. I mean, they're just stuff all over the ground. The harvest is past and it's left it all barren. And that's what's going to happen to you folks, see? They're going to cut you down is what they're going to do. And then he says this, yet the gleaning of grapes, the gleaning of grapes shall be left in it as the shaking of an olive tree. 2 or 3 berries in the top of the upmost bough, 4 or 5 in the outermost fruit branches thereof, saith the Lord of Israel. The gleanings. That's when you go and do and you harvest the grapes, and you don't get them all. There's a few left out there. The olives. You take all the olives. You can't reach the ones very tall, and one's way out on the branch. Just leave them. But there's not going to be much left, is there? There's not going to be much left of you. He says this, in that day shall a man look to his Maker, and his eyes will have respect to the Holy One of Israel. You've heard that saying, hadn't you? Prepare to meet your Maker. The reason these cities prospered at all was because of God. You need to be prepared to meet God, and it's time you turn back to the God that made you. And not to these idols. They had forsaken God. Look not on the altars, the work of his hands, neither respect that which his fingers have made, either the groves or the images. In that day shall his strong cities be as for a forsaken bough, and as the utmost branch which they left because of the children of Israel, and there shall be desolation. And then he says this, here's a reason. Because you have forgotten the God of your salvation, and hast not been mindful of the rock of thy strength. That's what happens when we forsake God. God forsakes us. Well, that ought to be a warning to us. Don't forsake God. Especially in the midst of prosperity. Don't forsake God. Therefore, and then it's like this. Look. You'll plant pleasant plants. Okay, think of the farmer. He goes out and he does all this work for a good harvest. And then when harvest time comes, everything is ruined. And that's what he's going to talk about here. You'll plant pleasant plants and set it with strange slips. That sounds like little cuttings. You're going to set the cuttings out there in the ground. You're going to set it with strange slips. This will be all very good, unique, special plants you're going to put out there for your harvest. And you're going to make them grow in the morning, and you're going to make the seed to flourish. But in the harvest shall be a heap in the day of grief and of desperate sorrow. You're going to do all this work, and it looks like maybe you're going to get a good harvest, but it's just going to be a heap. You're going to lose it at the harvest time because you've forsaken God. Woe to the multitude of many people which make a noise like the noise of the seas, and to the rushing of nations that make a rush like the rushing of mighty waters. It's like a flash flood. Think of a flash flood. Think of a tsunami. You know, when the tsunami comes in from the sea and does all this devastation, and then it quickly leaves. But it leaves destruction and devastation in its path. So think of a flash flood here. The Assyrians coming in just like a flash flood upon the land. They're not going to stay. They're going to quickly recede. And everything around them is going to be left in devastation. The nation shall rush like the rushing of many waters. But God shall rebuke them, and they shall flee afar off, and shall cease as the chaff of the mountains before the wind, and like a rolling thing before the whirlwind. And behold, at eventide trouble. And behold, before the morning he is not. This is the portion of them that spoil us, and the lot of them that do rob us. Other prophets in the Old Testament are going to say similar things about Damascus, both associated with the coming of the Assyrians and then following that of the coming of the Babylonians. But I want to go to the New Testament story. In the New Testament story of Damascus, we can learn what we must do to be saved. You see, the church was in Jerusalem, but it was undergoing great persecution. In Acts chapter 8 and verse 1, there's great persecution at the church. They were scattered abroad, and some of them went to Damascus. In Acts chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, Saul, the chief persecutor, went after them. He's going to bring them back to Jerusalem. So he goes out to Damascus. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus. And suddenly there shined a light round him as a light from heaven. And he fell to the earth and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I'm Jesus whom thou persecutest. It's hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And Saul realized the church he was persecuting was the church of Christ. And so he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said, Arise, go into the city. It'll be told thee what thou must do. And so the men were journeying with him. Saul fell to the earth. He had lost his sight. They lead him into the city. They brought him to Damascus. He's there 3 days and 3 nights. He wouldn't eat or drink. He wasn't saved on the road to Damascus. He was blinded on the road to Damascus. And he wanted to know what to do. And he is miserable. He is not rejoicing in salvation. He won't eat and he won't drink. But then the Lord comes to a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias. Told him to go to Saul. And said, go to the street that is called Straight. That was the main thoroughfare. We might call it Broadway. It was the main street through Damascus, and Paul was staying somewhere on that street. And inquire at the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus. He prays, and he's seen in a vision that you're coming to him. So Ananias said, Now, I've heard of this man. I don't know if I want to go. And the Lord says, No, you go. I'm going to show him what great things he must suffer for my name's sake. So Ananias went his way and entered into the house. Putting his hands on him, he said, Brother Saul, even the Lord, even Jesus that appeared unto thee as thou camest, hath sent me, that thou mightest receive sight and the Holy Ghost. And immediately there fell from his eyes as if it had been scales, and he received sight forthwith, and he was baptized. Remember, he said, What shall I do, Lord? He said, It'll be told you what thou must do. And he was baptized. Doesn't that tell you he was told to be baptized? And you don't have to guess at this. In Acts chapter 22 and verse 16, when Paul is telling this story himself, Paul said that Ananias said, Why tarriest thou? Rise and be baptized. Wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. And so that's why he immediately arose and was baptized. He wasn't saved on the road to Damascus because he had his sins. And he needed to be baptized. It's when he's being baptized, God's going to wash away his sins. It's by being baptized, he's going to call on the name of the Lord. He was already praying. But that wasn't going to save him. He needed to call on the name of the Lord by being baptized. And then Paul would later say, well, he received meat, he was strengthened, he started preaching at Damascus. Actually, he went from Damascus after that. After preaching, he went all down into Arabia and returned to Damascus. And they closed the city gates, and they were going to look for him and kill him. And the brethren let him down by a basket over the city, and he escaped and came to Jerusalem. Now, that's the last we read of Damascus. But Paul says this in 1 Timothy 1:16. The reason he obtained mercy, one of those reasons, is that he could be a pattern for them that hereafter should believe on him to life everlasting. You know what a pattern is? It's an example. It's what you follow. And so Paul, hearing believed, and were baptized. Now there's the pattern. You want to be saved? Don't go down the road thinking you're going to get a great light and pow, something's going to zap you and save you. That's not how it's going to happen. You want to be saved, follow the pattern. You need to hear and believe and be baptized. The street called Straight still runs through Damascus. I got on the computer and tried to find a picture of it, and there are several pictures, and they all look different. I'm not sure if this is exactly it. That's what it was labeled, the street called Straight, but a lot of the pictures look like this. They say there's a bazaar down there, and you can go down there. And I don't know if I'd want to go over there right now with all the troubles, but you can almost walk back into the back. In fact, the tour guide will show you where the house was, where Paul was staying. You know, they think that. I don't know if they know that or not. They tell me in that old street called Straight, one of those rivers that came out of Mount Hermon flowed right down near that street, and that's probably where Paul was baptized that night by Ananias. And I'll tell you what else you can do, though. You may never get to Damascus and go see the street called Straight like a tourist would, but you can be baptized. People say, well, I don't think y'all have to be baptized to be saved. Okay, that's what Naaman said about his leprosy. And the servant said, the prophet had bid thee to do some great thing. Wouldn't you have done it? How much rather than wash and be clean? And that's what we need to do. God didn't tell us to do some great thing. If He did, wouldn't you have done it? With your eternity at stake, with hell on one hand and heaven on the other, say, now this is what you need to do, and it's a great thing. Well, I'll do it. But He told us to do a humble thing, and He humbles us. He says, arise and be baptized, and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. That's the New Testament story of Damascus. And of all the stories, that's the one that ought to mean more to us than any other. Because that's where we learn what to do to be saved. If you'd like to be saved this morning, you can do it. Believe. Repent. Confess His name before men. Call on the name of the Lord by being baptized. And come up with those sins washed away in God's sight. So I'm going to extend that invitation, and you can respond if you'll come and sing.